The word hung in the air of my meticulously kept dining room, a foul, unexpected odor amidst the aroma of roast chicken and rosemary. Burden, it slithered from my son David's lips, polished and smooth like a river stone, yet carrying the jagged edge of a freshly broken shard of glass. His wife, Laura, seated beside him, offered a sympathetic, almost mournful nod, her eyes flicking towards me with a practiced pity that felt more insulting than outright disdain. Across the table, my daughter, Sarah, meticulously rearranged the peas on her plate, her silence a resounding chorus to her brother's pronouncement. Her husband, Tom, ever the opportunist, chimed in with a supportive, "Well, David's right, Martha. At your age, this big house, the constant upkeep, it's a lot for you to manage, and frankly, it's a constant worry for us. A kind of, well, yes, a burden on our minds, always wondering if you're coping." The us was a collective shield they brandished, implying their concern was a noble cross they bore. The irony was a suffocating blanket. This house, my house, the one my late husband, Richard, and I had poured our souls into, the sanctuary where these very children had been raised, their every scrape and triumph witnessed by its sturdy walls, was now reframed as my infirmity, my failing. And by extension, I, Martha, their mother, who had financed David's perpetually failing business ventures, who had paid for Sarah's 3 extravagant weddings to 3 equally unsuitable men, who still subtly supplemented both their lifestyles because their own choices rarely led to solvency. I was the albatross around their gilded necks. The crystal water glass in my hand felt suddenly heavy, the facets reflecting a distorted, wavering image of their concerned, predatory faces. A cold fury, sharp and pristine, began to crystallize in the pit of my stomach, a sensation so potent it almost cleared my head of the initial shock. I wanted to scream, to itemize their endless takings, their casual ingratitude, the decades of my life I had dedicated to their comfort and advancement, often at the expense of my own dreams. But I didn't. Instead, a chilling composure settled over me. I looked at each of them, my gaze lingering, allowing the silence to stretch, to become taut and uncomfortable for them, not for me. A burden, I repeated softly, my voice devoid of tremor, holding a stillness that seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst. That's a very illuminating perspective. Thank you for sharing your candid thoughts. It gives me a great deal to consider. David shifted, a flicker of unease in his eyes. Laura offered a weak, placating smile. Sarah finally looked up, a hint of defiance mixed with her usual petulance. Tom cleared his throat, perhaps sensing he'd overplayed his sycophantic hand. The rest of the dinner passed in a strained formality, their attempts at lighter conversation falling flat against the wall of my quiet contemplation. They likely assumed I was cowed, perhaps shamed into compliance with their unspoken desire for me to sell this house, liquidate my assets, and distribute the spoils amongst them under the guise of simplifying my life, and easing their worries. They couldn't have been more mistaken. As I cleared the plates they'd barely touched, the clink of porcelain against porcelain was the only sound accompanying the furious symphony in my head. A burden, was I? Very well. I would give them a burden. A burden they so richly, so profoundly, deserved. A burden they would carry, groaning, until they understood the true weight of that word. The planning for it began that very night, a meticulous, vengeful tapestry woven in the quiet solitude of my burdensome home. The echoes of their pronouncements, David's casual cruelty, Laura's saccharine pity, Tom's oily agreement, and Sarah's damning silence replayed in my mind like a discordant chorus long after they'd departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of their entitlement and the bitter taste of betrayal in my mouth. I wandered through the rooms of my home, each familiar object a testament to a life they now sought to dismantle for their convenience. The grandfather clock in the hall, its steady tick-tock a comforting rhythm for decades, now seemed to be counting down to a confrontation I hadn't sought, but would not shy away from. My fingers traced the worn velvet of Richard's favorite armchair, the indentations still holding the faint impression of his presence. What would he have thought of his beloved children now, so quick to cast aside the mother who had shouldered so much for them after his passing? He would have been appalled, his disappointment a far greater weight than any burden I supposedly represented. I remembered David's first failed startup, the one I'd mortgaged a portion of my future to salvage, only for him to squander the funds on frivolous expenses and ill-conceived strategies. Laura, his wife, had been all supportive smiles then, her gratitude as fleeting as the money itself. Then there was Sarah, whose artistic temperament, as she called it, translated into a series of expensive, short-lived passions: the pottery studio that gathered dust, the organic cafe that bled money, the jewelry-making business that produced more debt than adornments. Each venture had been enthusiastically presented, each failure met with a fresh plea for assistance, which I, fool that I was, had provided, always hoping this time would be different, that this time she would find her footing. Tom, her current husband, was the worst of the enablers, constantly praising Sarah's vision, while subtly steering her towards enterprises that seemed to benefit his own vague consulting activities. And all along, they had enjoyed the fruits of my labor living in properties I owned with minimal rent, accepting generous gifts that were, in reality, subsidies for their unsustainable lifestyles. The word burden was not just an insult, it was a profound mischaracterization, a deliberate inversion of reality. They had been the burdens, parasitic growths on the sturdy tree of my life, yet they had the audacity to project their own dead weight onto me. The cold fury from dinner had not dissipated, it had settled, congealed into a hard, diamond-like resolve. There would be no more quiet sacrifices, no more unquestioning support. The well, as they say, had run dry, or rather, it was about to be systematically, and very deliberately, poisoned for them. My mind, usually occupied with concerns for their well-being, began to work with a chilling clarity, sketching the outlines of a plan so audacious, so poetically just, that a grim smile touched my lips. They wanted me to be less of a burden. They wanted to manage my assets. Oh, I would give them something to manage, something that would consume their time, their energy, their very peace of mind. I would craft for them a gilded cage, a beautiful, inescapable albatross of their own making, forged from their own greed. The first step, I knew, was to seek counsel, not just any lawyer, but someone with a keen mind, an understanding of complex family dynamics, and a stomach for unconventional solutions. My thoughts turned to Alastair Finch, a contemporary of Richard's, a man known for his razor-sharp intellect and a rather deliciously cynical view of human nature. He had retired from his bustling city firm, but still consulted on select cases, preferring those with a certain, intricate challenge. This, I suspected, would pique his interest immensely. The next morning, I telephoned Alastair Finch. His voice, when he answered, was as dry and precise as I remembered, like autumn leaves crunching underfoot. "Martha Ainsworth," he said, a note of mild surprise rather than effusive warmth. "To what do I owe this unexpected call after, well, let's just say a significant passage of time?" I didn't waste words on pleasantries. "Alastair," I began, my tone matching his for directness, "I find myself in a situation requiring a particular brand of legal ingenuity, one that I believe aligns rather well with your known talents for navigating complex familial arrangements." There was a brief pause, then a chuckle, a dry rustle of sound. "Complex familial arrangements, you say? Martha, you have my undivided attention. When and where?" We arranged to meet at his secluded home office later that week, a place I recalled as being filled with books, antique maps, and an air of intellectual rigor. The intervening days were spent in a state of hyper-alertness. I observed my children and their spouses with new eyes, their every interaction, every casual assumption of my continued largesse, now catalogued as evidence for the prosecution in the silent trial I was conducting in my mind. Their phone calls, previously a source of connection, however strained, now felt like reconnaissance missions, probing for weakness, for signs of my capitulation to their unspoken demands regarding my house and assets. I played my part, of course, feigning a gentle confusion, a weary resignation that I hoped they would misinterpret as the beginnings of my decline. "Oh, David dear," I'd sigh when he'd call to check in, "this big house does get to be a bit much sometimes." Perhaps you and Sarah are right, the feigned vulnerability was a carefully cast lure, and I could almost hear the silent thrum of their avarice vibrating down the phone line. When the day of my appointment with Alastair arrived, I dressed with deliberate care, not in the subdued colours of a grieving widow or a downtrodden mother, but in a tailored suit of a deep crimson, a colour of quiet power and resolve. Alastair's home office was indeed a sanctuary of intellect, overlooking a meticulously maintained Japanese garden. He greeted me not with sympathy, but with an inquisitive, almost predatory gleam in his sharp blue eyes. "Martha," he said, gesturing me to a leather armchair that faced his imposing mahogany desk, "intrigue me," and so I did. I laid out the scenario, starting with the Burden comment, the years of their financial dependence, their current pressure to liquidate my assets, and finally, my audacious, nascent plan. I spoke without excessive emotion, presenting the facts as a case study in ingratitude and strategic retribution. As I spoke, Alastair listened intently, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable, save for that persistent, unnerving gleam in his eyes. When I finished, outlining my desire not merely to disinherit them, but to saddle them with a gift that would become their albatross, a truly significant, inescapable burden, a slow smile spread across his face, transforming his ascetic features into something almost wolfish. "Martha Ainsworth," he said, his voice laced with unholy amusement, "I believe you and I are going to get along splendidly. A burden, you say? A poetic, inescapable, and entirely legal burden. This has the hallmarks of a masterpiece." He leaned forward, the glint in his eyes intensifying. "Tell me, Martha, what kind of burden did you have in mind? We have many tools at our disposal: trusts with deliciously onerous conditions, properties with hidden financial sinkholes, business ventures that are Trojan horses of debt. The palette is rich." His enthusiasm was both terrifying and exhilarating. I knew then I had found my perfect co-conspirator. This wouldn't just be about protecting my assets, it would be about delivering a lesson, a masterclass in consequences, orchestrated with surgical precision and a deep, abiding sense of justice. The game was truly afoot. Alastair Finch, it turned out, was not merely a lawyer, he was an artist of aggravation, a connoisseur of the complex clause, a veritable maestro of the meticulously constructed inconvenience. Our planning sessions became exercises in creative malice, all conducted within the impeccable bounds of the law. "The key, Martha," he'd say, pacing his office, a predatory energy about him, "is not to be overtly punitive in the documentation. The gift must appear generous, even magnanimous, on the surface. The barbs must be hidden within the structure, the obligations, the unforeseen consequences that bloom only after acceptance." We discussed various properties, but one, in particular, caught Alastair's discerning eye. He'd found it through a niche real estate contact, Blackwood Manor, a sprawling, dilapidated Victorian Gothic estate on several acres of overgrown land, located in a remote, inconveniently charming part of the countryside. It was listed for a surprisingly low price, precisely because it was a Grade I listed building, meaning any repairs or alterations were subject to draconian heritage regulations, and would cost a king's ransom. Furthermore, it came with a slew of unresolved boundary disputes with cantankerous neighbours, and rumours of dry rot so extensive it was practically holding hands with the Deathwatch beetles. "This, Martha," Alastair had declared, his eyes gleaming with an almost religious fervour, as he showed me the bleak photographs, "is not merely a house. It is a financial black hole, a bottomless pit of despair masquerading as a stately home. It is, in short, perfect. The beauty of it was its sheer, unyielding resistance to easy solutions. Joint ownership between David, Sarah, and their spouses would ensure maximum discord when it came to decisions about its ruinous upkeep. Selling it would be a nightmare, given its condition and the preservation orders. Demolishing it was unthinkable. It was, quite literally, a burden that would keep on giving, or rather, taking. While Alastair began the discreet inquiries into purchasing Blackwood Manor, through a series of shell corporations to obscure my involvement initially, I focused on the other aspect of our plan, restructuring my existing, more desirable assets. My primary residence, the one they coveted, was placed into an irrevocable trust with such complex and restrictive clauses regarding its future sale or use by them that it would be virtually untouchable, its benefits instead flowing to a distant, appreciative niece and her young family upon my passing, and to a series of genuine charities I'd long supported. My investment portfolio was similarly ring-fenced, with new beneficiaries named primarily an educational foundation Richard and I had always dreamed of establishing. The accounts from which I'd previously disbursed their allowances were gradually depleted, the funds rerouted. It was a painstaking process, a quiet dismantling of the financial architecture that had supported their entitled lives. Simultaneously, I began to cultivate my performance. I allowed a slight tremor into my hands when I poured tea, feigned forgetfulness over small details, complained more frequently of aches and pains. I spoke often of my loneliness in the big, empty house, sighing about the complexities of managing my affairs. To my children, these were the welcome signs of my impending decline, the cracking of my resolve. David would pat my hand with false solicitude, saying, "Don't worry, Mum, we'll help you sort things out." Sarah would offer vague assurances of support, her eyes already calculating her share of the anticipated spoils. Laura and Tom, ever the obsequious chorus, would echo these sentiments, their concern as transparent as cheap glass. They were like vultures circling, their patience wearing thin, but their greed keeping them in an orbit of feigned affection. Little did they know the feast they anticipated was not the one I was preparing. The true pièce de résistance, Blackwood Manor, was acquired. The deeds were drawn up, ready for the grand reveal. Alastair and I reviewed every detail, every potential loophole, ensuring our masterpiece of malevolence was legally unassailable. The beauty of the plan, the sheer, elegant cruelty of it, filled me with a cold, clear satisfaction. It was not just revenge, it was an education. They had called me a burden. Soon, they would understand the true meaning of the word, an understanding etched into their bank accounts, their stress levels, and their increasingly fractious relationships with one another. The moment for the grand reveal arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon. I had summoned them all to my home, David and Laura, Sarah and Tom, under the pretext of an important family announcement regarding my future plans and the management of my estate. The air in my drawing room was thick with their barely concealed anticipation. They sat perched on the edges of their seats, faces arranged into masks of loving concern, but their eyes held the unmistakable glitter of avarice. David, ever the self-appointed spokesman, began, "Mum, we are all here for you. Whatever you've decided, we support you. We just want what's best for you, and for things to be manageable for whom, David?" I thought, but merely offered a wan smile. "Thank you, my dears," I said, my voice deliberately frail. "Your concern touches me deeply. And you are right. This old house, my affairs, they have become rather a lot for me. I've been doing a great deal of thinking, and I've made some significant decisions." I paused, allowing the tension to build, savoring the almost palpable hum of their greed. "I've realized," I continued, "that my greatest joy has always been my family. And as I get older, my priority is to ensure your future happiness and security. I want to leave a lasting legacy, something that will benefit you all, something you can share and build upon together. Laura dabbed at a non-existent tear. Tom nodded sagely. Sarah managed a tremulous smile. David looked like a cat who had not only found the cream, but was about to inherit the entire dairy. So, I announced, my voice gaining a theatrical warmth, I have made a rather substantial investment on your behalf. A family estate, a place for future generations, a testament to our bond. I have purchased Blackwood Manor, and I am gifting it to the four of you, jointly and equally. I produced a beautifully rendered architect's drawing. Alastair had commissioned a romanticized, sun-dappled depiction of Blackwood Manor that conveniently omitted the crumbling stonework, the boarded-up windows, and the encroaching wilderness. It needs a little work, of course, I added with airy understatement. A bit of a family project, perhaps. But imagine the holidays, the gatherings, the memories you will all create there. For a moment, they were stunned into silence, their minds clearly trying to process this unexpected turn. A country estate. It sounded grand, far grander than simply carving up the proceeds of my current home. David was the first to recover. Blackwood Manor, he stammered. Mum, that's incredibly generous. We don't know what to say. Sarah, her eyes wide, chimed in, a whole manor. For us. The initial shock was rapidly giving way to a dawning, incredulous delight. They envisioned a stately home, a symbol of newfound wealth and status. Tom was already mentally calculating its potential resale value, while Laura was no doubt redecorating its many non-existent drawing rooms in her mind. Alastair, present as my legal advisor to oversee the transfer, then presented them with the glossy brochures and the initial paperwork for their signatures, his expression one of benign professionalism. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I had also decided to transfer operational control of certain other long-term family investments to them, investments I was no longer able to manage actively. These were, of course, the shares in the company now burdened with carefully orchestrated debts and onerous contracts, and a few other minor properties that came with significant, undisclosed liabilities and maintenance nightmares. They signed the documents with alacrity, their hands almost trembling with eagerness, visions of grandeur and effortless wealth dancing in their heads. As they left that afternoon, showering me with effusive thanks and promises to visit Blackwood Manor at the earliest opportunity, their faces alight with triumph, I watched them go with a serene, almost beatific smile. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. The burden was now theirs to discover, piece by painstaking, expensive piece. The quiet satisfaction I felt was profound, a calm, deep ocean beneath the surface of my feigned fragility. The first exploratory visit to Blackwood Manor, by my darling children and their spouses, apparently occurred the very next weekend. I wasn't privy to the immediate aftermath, but Alastair, through his network of discreet local contacts in the village near the estate, received a rather vivid account. Their initial arrival, full of high spirits and grand expectations fueled by the romanticized architect's drawing, quickly devolved into stunned disbelief, then mounting horror. The little work I had mentioned was, in reality, a Herculean task of restoration that would beg a Croesus. The driveway was a treacherous, potholed track. The grand facade was crumbling, with several windows boarded over, and a distinct sag to one wing of the roof. The air, even outside, was thick with the smell of damp, decay, and despair. Inside, Alastair's contact reported, was even worse. Plaster hung in strips from the ceilings, revealing rotten lath. Floors were buckled and, in some places, dangerously soft. An intricate network of dry rot snaked across ancient oak paneling, and the wallpaper, where it hadn't peeled away entirely, depicted scenes of faded, depressing pastoral gloom. The sheer scale of the dereliction, the overwhelming sense of a house actively surrendering to the forces of nature, apparently left them speechless for a long while. Then, the recriminations began. Sarah, according to the report, burst into tears, wailing that it was a dump and accusing David of not having done any due diligence, as if he'd had any say in my gift. David, in turn, rounded on Tom, blaming him for not having the foresight to question such an extravagant gesture. Laura, ever practical when her own comfort was threatened, apparently started making frantic calculations on her phone, her face growing paler with each tap of the screen. The initial delight had curdled into a potent brew of disappointment and dawning panic. Shortly thereafter, the official notices began to arrive at their respective homes, forwarded via Alastair's office as per the transfer agreement. The first was the council tax bill for Blackwood Manor, a sum so eye-watering it could have funded a small nation. This was swiftly followed by a sternly worded letter from the County Heritage Preservation Society, outlining a long list of urgent, non-negotiable repairs required to prevent further deterioration of the Grade I listed structure, with accompanying estimates that ran into the many, many thousands. Then came the notification of the first mediation session for one of the ongoing boundary disputes with a particularly litigious neighbouring farmer, who claimed half of Blackwood's overgrown orchard was rightfully his. The other long-term family investments also began to reveal their true nature. The company shares they now controlled brought with them demands from creditors for the debts I had so strategically accrued against it just before the transfer. The minor rental properties turned out to have recalcitrant tenants, massive overdue repair bills, and were located in areas with plummeting property values. The calls started coming to me, of course. Initially confused, then pleading, then increasingly hysterical. "Mum, this Blackwood place, it's a ruin," David exclaimed, his voice tight with anxiety during one call. "The bills are astronomical. We can't possibly afford this." Sarah wailed in a separate call, "Those shares you gave us. The company is practically bankrupt. We are getting letters from lawyers." I listened with my practiced air of gentle confusion. "Oh dear, I'd say, that does sound complicated. I'm sure you'll all figure it out. You're all so clever. I just wanted to give you something lasting, a real legacy. My apparent obliviousness, my serene confidence in their abilities to manage these catastrophic burdens, seemed to incense them almost as much as the burdens themselves. The beauty of it was their utter entrapment. Joint ownership of Blackwood made unilateral decisions impossible, guaranteeing endless arguments and escalating costs as they dithered and disagreed. Selling it in its current state, with its preservation orders and legal disputes, would be a Herculean task, likely resulting in a massive loss, if they could find a buyer at all. They were shackled to a decaying monument of their own greed. The inevitable confrontation occurred about a month after the gifting ceremony. They arrived at my doorstep not individually, as they had with their panicked phone calls, but as a united, albeit visibly frayed, deputation of the aggrieved. Their faces were etched with stress, sleeplessness, and a simmering resentment that was almost comical to behold, given their earlier avarice. Gone were the masks of loving concern, in their place were expressions of raw, unfiltered fury. David, his usual smooth demeanor cracked and jagged, acted as their reluctant spokesman. "Mother," he began, his voice tight with suppressed rage, dispensing with any pretense of endearment, "we need to talk about Blackwood Manor. And these other assets." I ushered them into the drawing room, the very scene of their recent, hollow triumph, and settled myself into my favorite armchair, radiating an aura of calm that I knew would infuriate them further. "Of course, David," I said mildly. "Is there a problem?" "A problem?" Sarah shrieked, her voice cracking. "It's a catastrophe. That place is a money pit, a bottomless, disgusting, crumbling wreck. The Historical Society is threatening us with fines if we don't replace the entire west wing roof by spring." "The roof, Mother. Do you have any idea what that costs?" Tom, his face pale and drawn, added, "And the company shares you so generously transferred. The company is insolvent. We are being hounded by creditors for debts we knew nothing about. This isn't a gift, Martha, it's a setup." Laura, usually more composed, wrung her hands. "We can't afford any of this. We'll be ruined. We might lose our own homes trying to pay for that monstrosity you've saddled us with." Their accusations rained down, a torrent of indignation and fear. I listened patiently, my expression one of mild surprise and gentle concern, until they had exhausted their initial volley. Then, I leaned forward slightly, my gaze sharp and direct, my voice losing its feigned frailty and taking on the steely edge they hadn't heard in years, if ever. "Saddled," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "A monstrosity, you say? A money pit? A burden, perhaps?" Their faces registered a collective flicker of unease, a dawning, horrified recognition. David swallowed hard. What are you saying, Mother?" "I am saying," I continued, my voice cold and precise, "that you are finally beginning to understand the true meaning of the word burden, a word you and your spouses so casually, so cruelly, applied to me in this very room not so long ago. You worried about the burden of my home, the burden of my care, the burden of my very existence on your precious time and resources." I let my gaze sweep over each of them, seeing the fight drain out of them, replaced by a chilling comprehension. "You wanted to manage my assets," I went on. "Well, now you have assets to manage. You wanted a legacy. Blackwood Manor will certainly be a lasting one. It will require your constant attention, your unending financial commitment, your collective, and no doubt strained, cooperation." Sarah stared at me, her mouth agape. You did this on purpose." "On purpose," I echoed, a faint, mirthless smile playing on my lips. "My dear Sarah, I simply took your concerns to heart. You found me burdensome. So, I decided to relieve myself of certain burdens, and in my old age and apparent confusion, I seem to have passed them on to you. Consider it an early inheritance. The inheritance you so clearly felt you deserved. Now you have it. A burden for each of you, and one you can all share. I merely gave you precisely what you deserved." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by a strangled gasp from Laura. The fight was gone, replaced by the chilling realization of their utter defeat, their complete and total outmaneuver. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, and now they were reaping the whirlwind of their own callousness, served to them on a silver platter of poetic justice. The aftermath was a slow, agonizing unraveling for my beloved family. Blackwood Manor became the focal point of their shared misery, a constant drain on their finances, their time, and their already strained relationships. The joint ownership, as Alastair had predicted, was a masterstroke of induced conflict. David, pragmatic but increasingly desperate, wanted to cut their losses and sell it for whatever pittance they could get, even if it meant declaring bankruptcy on the associated debts. Sarah, however, clung to a bizarrely romantic notion that if they could just find a sympathetic investor, a role she clearly envisioned one of her ex-husbands fulfilling, Blackwood could be restored to its former glory, making them all rich and famous. Tom, meanwhile, secretly consulted with lawyers about dissolving the joint ownership or suing me, only to be repeatedly told that the gift was legally sound and my mental competence at the time of gifting was, according to Alastair's meticulous documentation, unimpeachable. Laura, watching their dwindling savings disappear into the maw of Blackwood's endless repair bills, became increasingly shrewish, her barbs directed equally at her husband for his past financial failures, and at her in-laws for their collective stupidity. Their previously comfortable lifestyles, subsidized by my generosity, collapsed. David had to sell his oversized SUV, and Laura, her collection of designer handbags. Sarah and Tom were forced to give up their trendy city apartment and move into a cramped rental, their dreams of artistic patronage and easy living evaporating like morning mist. They had to take on extra work, jobs they considered beneath them, just to keep their heads above water, to service the debts from the gifted company and the ever-increasing demands of Blackwood Manor. There were endless, bitter arguments. Family gatherings, once occasions for them to subtly pressure me, ceased altogether. The only time they communicated was to bicker over which urgent repair at Blackwood to fund next, or to accuse one another of not pulling their weight. The irony was exquisite. They were now truly burdened, not by an aging parent, but by a tangible, crumbling monument to their own greed and callousness. From my new, much smaller, but elegantly appointed apartment in a well-managed building with excellent amenities, all paid for from the assets I had successfully ring-fenced, I observed their struggles with a calm, detached satisfaction. Alastair kept me discreetly informed of their escalating woes. He reported that David was losing his hair from stress, Sarah had developed a nervous twitch, Tom was drinking heavily, and Laura was rumoured to be consulting a divorce lawyer. I felt no pity, only a profound sense of justice served. I had given them exactly what they deserved, a burden that mirrored the one they had tried to impose on me, but magnified and made inescapable by their own character flaws. My own life, in contrast, blossomed. Freed from their constant emotional and financial drain, I rediscovered passions I had long suppressed. I joined a book club, took up watercolor painting, and volunteered at a local hospice, offering genuine comfort to those truly in need. My distant niece and her children visited regularly, their affection and gratitude a balm to my soul. The Scholarship Foundation in Richard's name was thriving, supporting bright young students who reminded me that not all youth was characterized by entitlement. The roses in my small balcony garden bloomed with a particular ferocity that year, their beauty a quiet testament to a life reclaimed and a battle decisively won. The final, quiet triumph was not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, dawning peace within myself, a sense of equilibrium restored. The word burden, once a poisoned dart, had lost its sting. It had been redefined, transferred, its venom now coursing through the veins of those who had so carelessly wielded it. They were living its definition daily, an education more profound than any lecture I could have delivered. I occasionally saw them, from a distance, in town. David looked harried and much older, his expensive suits replaced by more modest attire. Sarah's once vibrant artistic flair had given way to a perpetual frown and an air of weary resignation. They never approached me. Perhaps shame, perhaps the sheer exhaustion of their self-inflicted predicament, kept them away. It mattered little. The ties had been severed, not just legally or financially, but emotionally. The mother they had known, the endless well of support and forgiveness, was gone, replaced by a woman who had finally prioritized her own dignity. Alastair Finch remained a steadfast friend, our occasional lunches filled with dry wit and unspoken understanding. He never explicitly gloated over the success of our project, but the twinkle in his eye when Blackwood Manor was indirectly mentioned spoke volumes. He once remarked, sipping his claret, "It is a rare thing, Martha, to see poetic justice so meticulously engineered and flawlessly executed." A true magnum opus of merited misfortune, I merely smiled. The merited misfortune of my children was not a source of active joy, but rather a confirmation of a natural law, that actions have consequences, that disrespect reaps a bitter harvest. My true joy came from the freedom I now possessed, the lightness of being unburdened by their expectations and manipulations. The assets I had preserved were now working for good, funding education, supporting charities, and ensuring my own comfortable and independent old age. This was the legacy Richard would have wanted, a legacy of purpose and quiet strength, not one squandered on ungrateful heirs. Sometimes, I would look at the faded photograph of Blackwood Manor Alastair had first shown me, the crumbling facade, the overgrown grounds, and I would think of them, trapped within its decaying embrace, forever bickering, forever paying, forever burdened. And I would feel a sense of profound, almost serene, closure. They had sought to diminish me, to reduce me to a liability. Instead, I had shown them the full measure of my strength, my resolve, and my capacity for a justice as cold and unyielding as the ancient stones of their inescapable inheritance. My revenge was not a fiery explosion, but a slow, inexorable turning of the screw, a burden perfectly tailored to its recipients, a burden they truly, truly deserved. And in their struggles, I found my peace, a quiet, unassailable victory that resonated more deeply than any shouted word or angry deed. I was, at last, truly free.